Hello, scholars. My name is Dr. Kara Dillon, and the goal of this channel is to make academic subjects easier to understand. In the last video, we addressed the 1980s and the Republican resurgence. In this video, we're going to focus on the presidencies of Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. The 1990s proved to be quite different than the 1980s. The population of elderly individuals was on the rise, and 4% of the total population was now 65 years old and older. The nation now had 4 million U.S. citizens who were over the age of 85 years old. The majority of these elderly lived in nursing homes, and 1/3 were on Medicare. 2/3 of these individuals voted in a majority of the elections. The 1990s also saw a record number of immigrants come to the U.S. in search of a new life. A majority of these immigrants came from Asia and Latin America. These immigrants tended to settle in Texas, California, New Jersey, Illinois, New York, Florida. Most Americans seemed to be fine with an increase in legal immigration, but many citizens became concerned with the growing number of illegal immigrants that were appearing within the country. Hispanic immigrants moved to small towns in Minnesota, Iowa, and even Georgia where they could find work. And 25% of these individuals fell below the poverty line. One of the most difficult challenges for these immigrants was securing an education even at the high school level. African Americans formed the second largest minority group in the 1990s. By 2002, almost 13% of the population was Black. African Americans tended to live in cities like Chicago, New York, and different places in the South. Education tended to be the key for African Americans seeking better employment and pay. From 1970 to 2000, the amount of Black individuals enrolling in college rose by more than 40%. Even though African Americans were now graduating college in record numbers, they still weren't being paid the same as whites with the same degree and work. In 1998, the poverty rate for Black families was twice that of white families. In March of 1991, a Black man by the name of Rodney King, who had been stopped for a traffic violation, was taken from his automobile and beaten by 4 Los Angeles police officers. The case took over a year to be settled, and an all-white jury acquitted all the police officers who were charged with police brutality. The people of South Central Los Angeles rioted, demanding justice and demanding $1 billion in buildings and cityscape. 53 people died in these riots, and the government promised to do better in the future. Near the year 2000, the fastest growing minority group immigrating into the U.S. were Asian Americans. Asian Americans made up 4% of the total population by the end of the decade and were increasing so quickly that 1 out of 10 Americans would be an Asian American by 2050. These Asian Americans were from China, India, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and the Philippines. Asian immigrants tended to be better educated as compared to other immigrants that sought homes in America. 75% of all Asian immigrants had graduated from high school and were the largest minority group that were college educated and had doctoral degrees. The presidential election of 1992 rivaled Democratic candidate Bill Clinton against Republican candidate President George Bush. The economic recession, which had started in 1990, was the major issue that Americans wanted addressed. Unemployment continued to be high for a year and a half, and because of this, President Bush would be a one-term president. H. Ross Perot, a Texas billionaire, jumped into the race and stated the deficit was the nation's biggest issue and demanded to be on the presidential ballot. Bill Clinton chose Al Gore as his running mate, and when Perot dropped out of the race after a couple of months, Clinton secured his position in the polls. The Republican Party continued to rip on Clinton as being a draft dodger of the Vietnam War and stated he was a womanizer. But Bill Clinton won the Electoral College with 370 votes as compared to Bush's 168. Bill Clinton was an intelligent and ambitious individual. He studied law at Yale and served as Arkansas's governor for quite a few years. His wife, Hillary Rodham Clinton, was a very accomplished attorney and helped him to win the presidency in 1992. When Clinton finally entered the presidency, it took him a couple of months to manage all the tasks that were expected of him as a president. It took him a while to deal with the media's criticism and how often he would be seen on camera. Clinton wanted a diverse administration. He appointed a Black woman, Hazel O'Leary, to be a Secretary of Energy. His cabinet had 2 Hispanic and 2 African Americans on it. He appointed Janet Reno as his Attorney General. Clinton was dedicated to deficit reductions and wanted to see it go down by 50% in his first 4 years. Bill Clinton had met with Alan Greenspan, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, in December before he took office. Alan Greenspan was an economics and statistical genius that worked for the Reagan and Bush administrations. Even though Greenspan and Clinton were drastically different, they both wanted to see the federal deficit stop growing while helping the economy to balance out. Both leaders knew that the interest on the deficit would continue to grow out of control. Greenspan informed Clinton that dropping the cost of borrowed money for homes and businesses would create economic growth and jobs. He stated this would also decrease the 6% unemployment rate. President Clinton trusted Greenspan and created a plan to cut spending and raise taxes on the wealthy. Greenspan was correct, and the economy improved so much that 20 million new jobs were created. Because the economy improved so substantially, the revenues from the prospering economy wiped out the deficit and created a $100 billion surplus. In the fall of 1993, Congress approved the North American Free Trade Agreement, Nafta. This agreement would allow Canada, the U.S., and Mexico to trade without economic borders. While President Clinton worked through the issues of Nafta, a congressman from Georgia by the name of Newt Gingrich began consolidating Republicans to achieve their conservative goals. Gingrich and his cohorts were able to force Speaker Jim Wright out of his position because of corruption charges, and he believed that he and other Republicans could finally work to secure a majority in both the House and the Senate in 1994. COPAC was an organization that assisted young conservatives with their candidacies if they agreed to sign a 10-point contract with America. The contract listed conservative goals such as middle-class tax cut, a line item veto for the president, term limits for members of Congress, and a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. When more stories started to surface about Bill Clinton's personal life and character, the American people began moving to more conservative positions. Issues of land development called Whitewater were brought up against Clinton, and the president had Attorney General Janet Reno investigate the issue of which illegal acts were not found. Travelgate was another issue that was brought to the attention of the public. Hillary Clinton fired several White House employees that arranged travel for media that were covering the president, and this did not sit well with the public. In 1994, Paula Jones filed a sexual harassment suit against Bill Clinton, which also upset the American people. The congressional elections of 1994 were shocking to most Americans. The Republicans gained 53 seats in the House of Representatives and 9 seats in the Senate, now having the majority in Congress. Newt Gingrich became the Speaker of the House. In 1996, Clinton was proud of the 9 million jobs that had been created since he became president. He was also proud of helping to pass the Family and Medical Leave Act of 1993. President Clinton also helped to increase the minimum wage in 1996. When Gingrich and the Republican Party attempted to get rid of programs like Medicare and Medicaid, the nation fought back. Clinton worked with the American public's frustration and told the people that the Republicans were working to cut education, health care, and college loans. Instead of defending their position, the Republican Party threatened to shut down the government if Clinton didn't agree with their agenda. Clinton knew that less people favored Gingrich than him, and he refused to do anything that Gingrich asked. When the public got angry, a majority of that anger was directed at Gingrich. Eventually, a welfare program was passed, which left a majority of the procedures to the states. The amount of federal grants would now be lessened, and individuals on welfare would need to secure a job within 2 years or their benefits would be dropped. The Republican Party chose Bob Dole as their presidential candidate, and Bill Clinton remained the Democratic Party candidate. Everything that Bob Dole tried was not successful, and Bill Clinton won his second term as President of the United States. President Clinton focused on domestic issues during his presidency. His greatest challenges in foreign policy had to do with Russia and China. Clinton continued to support President Boris Yeltsin of Russia and helped convince Congress to provide the nation with $2.5 billion in aid to help with free market reforms. When Vladimir V. Putin came to power, President Clinton also supported good relations with the country. The problems in Bosnia also led to additional conflicts for the Clinton administration. When the country of Yugoslavia broke apart in 1991, the president of Bosnia asked for various European nations to recognize the independence of Bosnia-Herzegovina. Bosnia was made up of 44% Muslims, 17 Croat, and 31 Serb. The conflicts that broke out between these people brought about a civil war in 1992. The Bosnian Serbs used guns to seize territory. They also began killing Muslims and Croats, performing ethnic cleansing, pushing them further and further from their ancestral farms and homes. These Croats and Muslims rushed the capital of Sarajevo. President Clinton and others backed a policy that would divide Bosnia into 10 ethnic provinces, but the Serbs refused the proposal. Serbs continued to fire on civilians, even in Sarajevo, as well as media who were showing the atrocities of these troops. Serbs slaughtered thousands of Muslim men and raped thousands of Muslim women. Finally, in 1995, Clinton unleashed American airstrikes. They shot at soldiers from the air and from the mountains. These strikes went for 2 weeks. This eventually led to a ceasefire in October of 1995. The country was then divided into 2 parts, one that had 51% of the territory and would house Muslim Croatian people in a federation of their own. The Serbian territory would make up 49% of the land. President Clinton did quite well with issues of the economy, had some trouble dealing with the issues of Bosnia-Herzegovina, and was quite surprised by the extreme violence that took place as anti-government plots, radical gun owners, and school shootings took place. In August of 1992, a Christian survivalist by the name of Randy Weaver sold weapons illegally, and federal agents attempted to arrest him within Ruby Ridge, Idaho. Those federal agents ended up shooting and killing Weaver's wife and son during an 11-day siege. The American public was dumbstruck. Ruby Ridge became the perfect example for right-wing activists to express their hatred of the federal government. A second tragic event took place in the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas. Its leader, David Koresh, was supposed to be arrested because of selling guns and weapons, which ended up with federal agents coming to the compound and firing upon persons inside the compound, killing 75 Branch Davidian members. After the tragedy of Waco, citizens all over the U.S. joined various militia units that arose in more than 30 states. On the very anniversary of the Waco tragedy, Timothy McVeigh rented a truck and set up a powerful bomb inside the back of it. He then parked next to the Oklahoma City Federal Building, and when the blast went off, it killed over 160 men, women, and children. McVeigh was caught less than 100 miles from the scene of the disaster and was sentenced to die for this crime. He never showed remorse for what he'd done, and even when he heard his own death sentence being proclaimed, it didn't seem to bother him. As political sides continued to spread apart, the far left and the far right created hatred within the nation. The Unabomber, who was an unknown enemy of the global economy, sent 16 bombs through the mail to various professors and corporate executives from 1978 to 1995. 3 individuals were killed and over 20 were wounded. In 1995, the Washington Post published the Unabomber's manifesto. He pushed against humanity's ills throughout the manifesto, but his words really didn't stand the test of time. It was only a year later, in 1996, when the Unabomber's brother recognized and helped federal agents to find and arrest Theodore Kaczynski in a remote cabin in Montana. Kaczynski had a doctorate in mathematics and had a teaching position at the University of California, Berkeley, but resigned in 1969 to live in seclusion. When arrested, he refused to plead insanity. He eventually pled guilty to 13 federal charges and got life in prison without any possibility of parole. In addition to bombs that were sent through the U.S. mail, school shootings began to take place. In April of 1999, 2 high school boys in Littleton, Colorado, used automatic weapons to kill 12 students and 1 teacher. The nation was in complete shock and outrage. Many Americans called for tighter gun controls and more adult supervision around weapons. Just when the Clinton administration hoped the controversies were now over, Kenneth Starr, a special prosecutor who was appointed in 1994, began looking into President Bill Clinton's relationship with a White House intern, Monica Lewinsky. At first, Lewinsky denied having any sexual relationship with the president. Evidence that came to light soon contradicted her claims. Eventually, it was found that their relationship began in 1995 when Lewinsky was 22 years old and continued into 1997. A co-worker of Lewinsky ended up producing tapes of telephone conversations to the prosecutor. When the media found out about the tapes, they went wild and demanded President Clinton to explain himself. President Clinton was very lucky that his wife stood beside him and declared it was an all-right-wing conspiracy to take down the Democratic Party. Eventually, Starr offered Lewinsky a wipe of all criminal acts if she agreed to testify. This is when she finally came forward and described her sexual acts with the president. When Lewinsky confessed, President Clinton knew he'd finally have to admit to his inappropriate behavior. He went on camera and apologized to the American people, to his wife, and to his family. Starr eventually provided a report to Congress that showed they would bring multiple charges against Clinton in the form of impeachment. Perjury, lying to Congress, was President Clinton's biggest factor for impeachment. The House of Representatives decided on 4 articles of impeachment, but ended up rejecting 2 of them. Clinton was brought on charges of obstruction of justice and perjury, but the Senate would refuse to convict him. President Clinton was impeached, but he was not removed from office. Even though President Clinton wasn't seen very well in the short term, in the long term, he was seen as popular and effective. When President Clinton neared the end of his second term, his faltering characteristics gave an opening to the Republican Party to capture the White House. Governor George W. Bush of Texas was the Republican Party's candidate for president, while Vice President Al Gore was the Democratic Party's candidate. Whereas Gore tended to use statistics and at times exaggerate various ideas, Bush tended to speak in broad terms and wasn't the most elegant speaker. Bush ran on limiting the role of the federal government, as most Republicans do. The presidential race was extremely close, and the media called the wrong winner before the race was actually over. At first, the media predicted Al Gore as the winner of Florida, but later put Florida back into the undecided category. When the media called Bush the eventual winner of Florida, they again had to take it back. For 5 weeks, it was unknown who actually won Florida. Both Gore and Bush's lawyers headed to the southern state to fight for their candidate. The Florida Supreme Court eventually called for a recount, but the Supreme Court overruled the state court in a 5-4 decision. George W. Bush was declared the winner of Florida and the eventual winner of the presidency of the United States. Bush chose Colin Powell as the Secretary of State, and he favored diplomacy over the use of force. Bush appointed John Ashcroft as the Attorney General, which was very controversial. The president's first act was to cut taxes by $1.35 trillion over a decade. He also sent out a tax rebate to individuals. Couples received $600 and individuals got $300. Bush was also able to secure an educational program called No Child Left Behind. Students would now have to take standardized tests in order to prove that they had learned certain objectives. President Bush became frustrated as he fought recession after recession and major corporations collapsed. Companies like WorldCom Inc. declared bankruptcy, which shocked the nation. As fraudulent practices were exposed to the nation, less and less of the public trusted big corporations. As more corporations went down, unemployment started to rise quite significantly. On September 11, 2001, 4 different airlines were hijacked by 19 Islamic terrorists and used as weapons against the U.S. government and its people. 2 airplanes that were taking off from Boston's Logan Airport, full of jet fuel, were hijacked and were flown directly into the 2 towers of the World Trade Center. The first plane hit the North Tower toward about 9 a.m., and the second plane hit the other tower about 20 minutes later. The heat from the blast caused the steel frame to buckle, and within 2 hours, both towers collapsed. There were about 300 lives trapped inside the towers, and 300 firefighters that were trying to save them lost their lives. An American Airlines airplane that was headed toward Los Angeles Dulles Airport was also hijacked by 5 Islamic terrorists. This airplane was a Boeing 757 and made the Pentagon its target, killing almost 200 civilian and military personnel. A 4th plane that was hijacked was a United Airlines airplane that took off from New Jersey heading to San Francisco. It was Flight 93, and over the state of Pennsylvania, hijackers on board tried to overtake the plane and turn it toward the nation's capital. They were able to take over the cockpit, but passengers aboard the plane found out what had happened in the nation and decided to fight back. It was unknown what the target of this plane was, but many guessed it to be the Capitol or the White House. When passengers fought back against the hijackers, the plane was forced down and crashed in southern Pennsylvania. All 44 passengers, crew members, and the hijackers were killed. President Bush was in a second-grade classroom when he was informed of the terrorist attack. The Secret Service was very concerned the terrorists wanted to kill the president and swiftly accompanied him onto Air Force One, and they flew to a base in Louisiana and then a base in Nebraska. President Bush eventually demanded to go back to the White House, where he later gave a speech to the American people saying the U.S. would go after the terrorists and anyone that had assisted them in their livelihood. President Bush declared a war on terrorism on live television. President Bush, within the week, visited Ground Zero, the area in which the World Trade Center collapsed in New York City. He was completely dumbstruck by the devastation. He was given a megaphone when someone told him they couldn't hear him, and he shouted into the microphone, "I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you. And the people who knocked these buildings down will hear all of us soon." The crowd reacted in cheers of USA, USA. When President Bush returned home, he met with Congress on September 20th and gave a speech that 80 million people watched on TV. What the nation later found out was that Osama bin Laden, the leader of a terrorist organization called Al-Qaeda, was in charge of the terrorist attacks. Bin Laden had helped to form Al-Qaeda during Desert Storm when American troops gathered and formed a presence in Saudi Arabia. Al-Qaeda was a fundamentalist Islamic religious organization that sought to bring strict religion back to the Middle East and get rid of any foreign influence, especially American influence. Eventually, the CIA shared evidence with the American government proving that bin Laden and Al-Qaeda were involved in the bombing of 2 American embassies and the September 11, 2001 attack. Al-Qaeda had first organized itself in Sudan and then later set up a camp in Afghanistan after the Taliban took control over the country. The camps were used to train terrorists and recruited people from Indonesia, the Philippines, and various Middle Eastern countries. President Bush decided to attack Afghanistan and work with the Pentagon as well as the CIA to invade the country to get rid of Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and kill Osama bin Laden. The CIA and the part of the American Army worked with the political organization in Afghanistan and were able to install a temporary government in Kabul. As American troops moved about Afghanistan, bin Laden was able to evade capture. He took to the mountains near the Pakistani border. The CIA and FBI were able to capture ranking members of Al-Qaeda, but still couldn't nab the leader. President Bush created the Department of Homeland Security, which combined the Coast Guard, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, and Customs to help fight against terrorism. Tom Ridge would lead the new department and jumped right into action with the anthrax scare of the fall of 2001. In October 2001, many employees in a Florida newspaper company became extremely sick, and it was found by healthcare professionals that they had inhaled anthrax spores that came from an envelope within the mail. Times became even scarier when NBC anchor Tom Brokaw's secretary opened a letter addressed to Brokaw and became extremely sick. Everyone became really worried to open their mail because they were worried it would have anthrax in it. By November, a few letters to members of Congress had anthrax in them. By this point, security systems were able to sense whether or not there was poison in the mail. As quickly as the anthrax scare came, it seemed to disappear. The major focus on the Department of Homeland Security was the safety of airline travel as well as mass transit travel. President Bush, along with the Congress, signed a law that replaced security with government employees at all airports for screening purposes. Every cockpit door of airplanes became impenetrable, and pilots could not open the door for any purpose, even if passengers were being attacked. The department placed air marshals on various flights who carried guns in case the plane was hijacked. The air marshals were trained to shoot any terrorists that threatened to overtake the plane. These actions helped Americans to feel more secure about flying, and eventually the industry began to recover. President Bush's popularity rose as he made changes to fight against terrorism. In a State of the Union address, President Bush stated that Iran, Iraq, and North Korea were all part of an axis of evil. Bush was determined to make sure these nations did not have weapons of mass destruction, and he called the United Nations inspectors to search Iraq for such weapons. When the United Nations put pressure on Saddam Hussein to allow inspections, Hussein continued to state no. The U.S. stated it would go to war with Iraq, and finally Saddam Hussein relented. The United Nations searched but didn't find any weapons of mass destruction. This did not seem to appease President Bush, and on March 18th, he decided to launch a laser bomb airstrike and a cruise missile into a bunker in Baghdad on information that Saddam Hussein was there. 24 hours later, 65,000 soldiers took part in 2 separate invasions on Iraq from bases in Kuwait. They were able to secure southern Iraq as well as the city of Basra. The soldiers made it to about 100 miles of Baghdad when Iraqi forces swarmed in. American troops worked really hard to secure their supplies and tried to push toward Baghdad. When Saddam Hussein sent in his elite soldiers, he wasn't expecting American airstrikes that took out some of his best. Eventually, the army was able to take the Baghdad International Airport. 3 weeks later, American Marines moved into the city without much of any opposition. The Iraqi people pulled down a statue of Saddam Hussein located in Fardos Square. The combat part of the war was considered basically over on April 8th. There continued to be resistance movements north of Baghdad, but President Bush stated no other huge combat movement would ever be needed in Iraq again. No American soldiers or military presence in Iraq found weapons of mass destruction. American troops continued to resist Iraqi attacks north of Baghdad, which increased in the middle of 2003 and got worse as the months continued. On average, there were 3 to 4 American soldiers that were killed per week. Economic recovery within the nation was slow because of resistance to American occupation. Eventually, Saddam Hussein was captured in December of 2003, which helped President Bush's popularity. America and its military couldn't seem to stop the roadside bombs and mortar attacks that continued on businesses and residencies in Iraq. Handheld missiles were shot at American copters, and bombs alongside the road killed and wounded American peacekeepers. Okay, so this is the end of the video, and that's good because I'm almost losing my voice. There was lots of important information, and I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, please click that like button and don't forget to subscribe. Have an incredible day, and I will talk with you soon.